There's a specific kind of fear that is very different from being startled. It doesn't come quickly. It doesn't spike and fade. It builds slowly, the way cold water rises around you before you realize how deep you've already gone. It's the fear you feel when something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is yet. The fear that arrives before your brain has finished processing. The fear that makes every hair on your arms stand up, not because something jumped out at you, but because something simply shouldn't be there. And it is. Tonight, we have 3 of those stories. 3 real accounts from real people, each one set inside a place that should have been completely, totally, undeniably empty. And in each one, it wasn't. We are forgotten cases. And this is what happens when you go looking for a place the world left behind, and find out that the world isn't the only one who remembered it. Let's begin. Every town has one. A place that exists somewhere between local legend and local reality. A place that kids dare each other to visit, that parents warn you about, that older brothers describe in dramatic detail on Friday nights when they want to scare a room full of 6th graders. For one person growing up in their hometown, a person we'll call Marcus in this story, that place was the abandoned military village. From what Marcus eventually pieced together online, the site had been active primarily during World War II and the Cold War. At its peak, it had housed more than 200 military families at once. It was a self-contained community, homes, a church, common spaces. A small, sealed-off neighborhood that operated completely within the perimeter of a military base. And then, in 1984, it was simply left. Not demolished. Not repurposed. Just locked, fenced, and forgotten. Entire houses still standing. Furniture still inside. And like that, a small community became a ghost town almost overnight. It sat untouched for 30 years until it was finally torn down in 2014. But Marcus didn't know any of that growing up. What he knew was the version that spread through school hallways and neighborhood backyards. Demonic gatherings. Underground military experiments. Strange lights seen from the road at night. Every story more unsettling than the last. And then there was the version his older brother told him. Marcus was in middle school when his brother came into his bedroom one night. Marcus had friends over, and his brother sat down on the edge of the bed with this look on his face. That look older siblings get when they know something you don't. He told them he'd been to the village. Nobody believed him. He was probably just trying to scare them. But then he started describing specific details. He described the church in the center of the village, the way it looked like it had been frozen in the middle of a Sunday service. And he mentioned something that stuck with every person in that room for years afterward. He said there was a trap door in the floor of the church, right next to the altar. And he said that when he got close to it, he could hear something coming from below. Moaning, like a voice, but not quite right. Low and distant and continuous. He laid it on thick. He was probably exaggerating. He was almost certainly making half of it up. But here's the thing about a story told at the right moment, in the right room, to the right people. It doesn't matter if it's true. It feels true. And once it feels true, it becomes part of you. Marcus and his friends talked about that village for years. Through the rest of middle school. Into high school. They told each other they would visit once they could drive. Once they were old enough. Once they were brave enough. But there were always 2 problems. First, they didn't actually know where it was. They knew it was somewhere near the airport. They knew the general area. But the whole region out there was marked with no trespassing signs, and the village's exact location wasn't on any map they could find. The internet barely had anything on it back then, which somehow made the whole thing feel even more mysterious. Second, even abandoned, it was still technically part of a military facility. And none of them really knew what getting caught would even mean in a place like that. So the years passed. The stories grew. And the visit never happened. Until their senior year. One spring night, their friend Alex came to them with something different. He said he knew where the entrance was. Marcus didn't believe him. He was so convinced Alex was bluffing that he actually pushed back harder than usual, said they should just go, right now. and Alex could show them exactly where it was. He was certain they'd drive around for an hour and find nothing. That this would be the moment Alex's story finally fell apart. They left around 11 that night. Marcus was behind the wheel. Alex was in the passenger seat, and from the very first moment they got near the area, Alex was already nervous. He kept telling Marcus to pull over. Every few hundred feet, he'd say, "I think this is it." And every time, it turned out to be a drainage ditch, or a utility road, or just another stretch of empty field. And then they found it. An overgrown road that barely looked like a road anymore. Just two parallel tire tracks cutting into the brush, almost entirely swallowed by grass. And at the edge of it, barely visible through the low-hanging branches, a faded, rusted "No Trespassing" sign. Alex said that was it. Marcus turned off his headlights and let the car roll forward. He drove slowly down the dirt path in almost total darkness, the trees pressing in from both sides. And then they came to the first gate, one of those horizontal bar gates that go up and down at security checkpoints, the kind with a booth beside it for a guard. The booth was empty, had been for decades. Marcus got out and lifted the gate manually. He got back in the car, and they kept driving. Then he saw the furniture. On both sides of the dirt road, scattered in the weeds, beds, dressers, side tables, chairs. Like someone had taken the contents of several homes and just left them beside the path. Not dumped carelessly, just left, as if people had carried them outside and then never came back for them. Nobody said anything. They reached a second gate. This time Marcus had Alex get out and lift it. And when Alex pulled it up and they rolled through, they were inside. 30 years of buildup, and then they were just there. Marcus described it later as feeling like the set of a movie, like a neighborhood, but the wrong version of one. Small houses lined up along streets, a church in the center, cars long since removed, but everything else still standing, everything decaying, everything silent. He parked in front of the church. The three of them got out slowly, quietly, and started to walk. Marcus noticed almost immediately that there were no visible cameras, no lighting, no indication that anyone monitored this place at all. That helped a little. They went to the church first. Inside, the walls were covered in graffiti, faded messages and artwork layered on top of each other, some of it years old. Pews still in rows, covered in dust. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than normal quiet because everything around you is so still it almost feels deliberate. Marcus went straight to the altar. He looked at the floor on either side of it, walking the whole length of it slowly. There was no trapdoor. He expected that. Of course there wasn't. His brother had made up most of the story. But he still found himself standing there for a moment, looking at the place where the door was supposed to be. They moved on to the houses. Some of them had been partially destroyed, collapsed roofs, caved-in walls, sections that looked like they'd been gutted by weather or vandals or both. But others were almost intact. Windows still in the frames, doors still on their hinges. And those ones, the intact ones, were the worst. Because an intact abandoned house is somehow more wrong than a broken one. A broken house looks like time happened to it. An intact one looks like something stopped. Their fourth friend, Scott, was not handling any of this well. Scott was always the nervous one, had been since they were kids. And from the moment they entered the village, Scott kept insisting something was off. He kept saying he felt like they weren't alone. The others kept telling him to relax, that it was just his imagination running warm in a place like this. They went inside one of the intact houses, and then they all heard it. A sound. Not the ambient noise of an old building settling. Something more specific than that. A creak. The kind of creak that floors make when weight moves across them. Marcus asked if everyone had heard it. They all had. Alex, always the bold one, called out into the silence, "Is anyone there?" The sound stopped. They stood in that room for a long moment, not moving, barely breathing. Marcus was ready to leave. He said so out loud. He wanted to go, right now. This felt wrong, and he wanted to get back to the car. Alex and Nick wanted to stay. Since Marcus had the keys, he made the call. They were leaving. They started walking toward the front door. And that's when Scott stopped moving. He didn't say anything. He just raised his hand and pointed, slowly, carefully, toward one of the windows on the far side wall. The window looked out toward the house next door. Moving across the outside wall of that neighboring house were 3 shadows. Heads. Human-shaped heads moving. 3 of them. Everyone went completely silent. Marcus stepped to the window as quietly as he could and looked out. For just a moment, he could see the silhouettes moving, and then they turned the corner and disappeared around the back of the adjacent house. He turned to the group and didn't need to say anything out loud. They ran. All 4 of them bolted through the front door and sprinted toward the car. And they were almost there. The car was right there when Scott screamed. Not a gasp, not a startled noise. A full, desperate scream. They looked. Standing beside the rear door of Marcus's car was a woman. Tall, wearing a long black dress that looked old, worn out, almost falling apart. She had the back door open. One leg was already inside the car, like she was mid-step into the back seat. When Scott screamed, she let go of the door, and she walked away, quickly, without looking at them, directly into the church. They didn't stop. They didn't slow down. They got into the car and Marcus drove. He drove so fast on the gravel path that the car started to slide and he nearly lost control in the dirt, almost swerving into the trees. Nobody spoke until they were on the road. Later that night, the 4 of them went back and forth trying to explain what they'd seen. The most rational answer, and Marcus still thinks it's probably close to correct, is that those people were living there, using the abandoned village as shelter. It wouldn't be impossible, especially before the property was eventually demolished. That explains the shadows. That explains the creaking inside the house. Scott sensed that something was off. Maybe even the furniture abandoned by the road. Maybe someone had moved it around over the years. But it doesn't fully explain the woman at the car. She wasn't walking by. She wasn't startled by them and running away. She was inside the car door. Like she had calmly walked up to their car, found the back door, opened it, and was in the process of getting in. And the thing that bothers Marcus most, even now, years later, is the timeline. They had been inside the village for a while that night. They had walked around slowly. They had gone into multiple buildings. And not once, in all of that time, did they see a single sign of another person. Not a light. Not a noise until the creak. Not a single trace. And then, within a window of about 90 seconds at the very end of the night, shadows, a creak, 3 figures, and a woman in a black dress getting into their car. Where had she been the entire time they were there? Marcus thinks about that question sometimes, especially now that the village is gone. Torn down in 2014. Whatever it was they walked through that night no longer exists. Whatever lived in that place, person or otherwise, has moved on. He's glad Scott screamed when he did. He's glad they were already running. There's a period in a lot of people's lives, usually somewhere in their early 20s, where they do things they'd never do later on. Not because they were careless or irresponsible as people, just because the combination of youth, curiosity, and having someone beside them who made everything feel less serious meant that certain lines were easier to cross. For the man in this next story, we'll call him Daniel. That person was the woman who would eventually become his wife. She was the explorer. He was the one who went along for the ride because he liked her and didn't want to seem like the person who said no to everything. She had a fascination with abandoned houses. Not in a dangerous way. She wasn't reckless about it. She just had this genuine, burning curiosity about the lives of the people who had left these places behind. What did their homes look like? What were the last things they'd touched? What could you piece together about a person from the space they'd lived in and then disappeared from? Daniel did not share that curiosity, but he went. Every time. They explored plenty of houses together over those years. Old farmhouses, empty row homes at the edge of subdivisions, a handful of buildings that were somewhere between abandoned and derelict. Most of the time, nothing happened. Creaky floors, dim flashlight beams, the occasional animal noise that sent them both outside faster than they'd like to admit. But The night started like most of their others. She had found something, a house, nowhere near any road, nowhere near anything. It wasn't visible from the main road. She had found it by what Daniel later gathered was a combination of satellite imagery and local tips. Old house. No longer on any deed that made sense. Just sitting there in an overgrown field, miles from the nearest anything. When they arrived, the first thing Daniel noticed was the structure. It looked like it was barely upright. One good wind in the wrong direction, and he was fairly sure the whole front facade would simply give up and fall inward. He told her this. She nodded like it was a reasonable observation and kept walking toward it. The front door had been boarded up. 2 horizontal planks across the frame. Daniel kicked them off. He was always the one tasked with the physical part of entry, and the door swung open. The living room was missing half its floor. Right in the center of the room, a hole. Just open space where the floorboards should have been, dropping straight down into the basement. Daniel pointed his flashlight down. He could see old stone walls below, broken wooden supports, the remnants of whatever had been stored down there before it all caved in. He told her they should probably leave. She said, "Just wait a minute." This was her line. It had always been her line. Daniel had heard it so many times over the years that it had become a kind of joke between them. The thing she said when she'd already decided they were staying and was simply letting him finish his sentence before proceeding as planned. She moved carefully around the edges of the room, skirting the hole, disappearing down a hallway. Daniel stayed by the front door. For a few minutes, he held his position. He genuinely did not trust the floor, and he said so out loud to no one in particular. But curiosity is a strange thing. It doesn't respect rational decisions. It creeps in around the edges, and before you've made a conscious choice, you're already moving. Daniel made his way into the back room. She was in there, working her way through stacks of things that had been left behind, old magazines, boxes of tools, what looked like children's clothing in a pile near the window. She was in her element. This was the part she loved, the archaeology of a life. She looked up at him and told him to check the upstairs. He did not want to check the upstairs. She said, "The sooner we look at everything, the sooner we can leave." He went upstairs. The staircase held. Barely, but it held. Daniel went up one step at a time, testing his weight, bracing against the wall, certain at any moment that the whole thing would give way beneath him. At the top, a narrow hallway. One room to the right, one at the end of the hall to the left. He went right first. Old bedroom. A bed still in the frame, still made, which he found unexpectedly strange. A folded bathrobe at the foot of the bed, like it had been placed there for someone returning home that never came. Clothing piled everywhere. A dresser with one drawer hanging open. A rocking chair in the corner of the room, which he noticed but didn't think much of. In the corner of the room, a crawl space. Low to the floor, maybe 2.5 feet tall. He ducked inside. The smell hit him immediately. Dust and mildew and something sweetly rotten underneath that he couldn't identify. The space inside was stacked with baby things. Boxes of diapers, still in packaging. Glass jars of old baby food. All of it completely coated in dust, clearly untouched for many years. Some of the jars had been opened by rodents from the look of it, the lids gnawed apart. He was about to back out when he heard it. Creaking. Not the building settling kind. Not random. Rhythmic and slow. He swung his flashlight around the crawl space. And there, in the far corner, another opening. A narrow gap, barely wide enough to crawl through, running horizontally across what looked like the length of the house. And the sound was definitely coming from that direction. Daniel was too large to fit through the gap. He backed out of the crawl space, stood up in the bedroom, and made his way back to the hall. He walked toward the other bedroom. The creaking got louder as he got closer. He stepped through the doorway. There was a woman sitting in a rocking chair in the far corner of the room. Her back was to him. He could see the top of her head and what looked like a long, dark skirt draped over her legs. She was rocking. Slowly. Steadily. Like someone who had been sitting there for hours and intended to sit there for several more. Daniel didn't speak. He stood in the doorway and tried to see her face in the reflection of the window. It was too dark. The glass only gave back a smear of blackness and shadow. He could see her silhouette rocking, and that was all. He took one step forward. The floor creaked under his foot. She stopped. Daniel started to speak, started to apologize, started to explain that they didn't know anyone lived there, that they were leaving, that this was a mistake, and before he could finish, she started rocking again. Like she hadn't heard him. Like his presence had registered and then been dismissed. He took one more step toward her and asked if she was all right. She stopped again. Slowly, she stood up from the chair. She stood there in front of it for a moment, and then she made a sound. Not a word. A low, continuous hum. Not a tune, just a sound, monotone and low, somewhere between a moan and the beginning of a word that never finished. And then she turned around to face him. Daniel ran. He didn't see her face clearly. It happened too fast. He had one fraction of a second of impression, old, deeply wrinkled skin, a mouth that was either open or collapsed inward. And then he was out of the room. He was at the top of the stairs. He was going down two at a time and yelling for her to get out. They needed to leave. Someone was up there. She was in the back room. She didn't believe him. He pleaded. He told her exactly what he'd seen. She looked at him with the patient, slightly amused expression she always had when she thought he was exaggerating, and she walked past him and up the stairs. He stood at the bottom and called after her. She didn't stop. He heard her footsteps in the hallway. He heard her stop at the doorway. And then he heard her say those three words. "Oh my God." He ran to the foot of the stairs. A pause. And then she laughed. She walked back out and called down to him asking if he was scared of the rocking chair. He went up. The room was empty. The chair was there. Nobody in it. She checked every corner, every shadow, the crawl space entrance. Nothing. Not a trace of anyone. She walked back past him toward the stairs, saying they could leave now if he wanted. He stood in that room for one more second, looking at the chair, looking at the window. They both walked toward the staircase. And then they both heard it. The creak. Rhythmic. Slow. Growing. She stopped walking. She turned back toward the bedroom. He watched her face change. She took a few steps toward the doorway. And she heard it too, the humming. Quiet, low, monotone, coming from inside the room. She got to the doorway. She looked inside. The chair was rocking. Someone was sitting in it. She didn't engage. She turned around and she ran. Daniel was already moving. They went down the stairs together and out the front door, and they didn't stop until they were at the car. She was shaking. She kept asking what they had just seen. Her voice had completely changed, the amusement gone, replaced by something Daniel had almost never heard from her before. Fear. He didn't look back at the house as they drove away. He wanted to. He wanted to see if anyone was standing in that upstairs window, watching them go. He decided he didn't want to know. Daniel still turns this over in his mind. The most available explanation is that it was simply a very old woman who still lived in the house. Not unheard of. There are cases of elderly people living in conditions that seem impossible to outsiders, in houses that have fallen completely apart around them. Someone who had outlasted the house itself. But the door had been boarded from the outside. They had kicked it open. If someone was living there, how were they getting in and out? And the hole in the living room floor, that gap dropping down into the basement, made the first floor nearly impassable in the dark. And she was there when he came back with his girlfriend. She was gone when they came back alone. And then she was there again. Like she existed only on her own schedule, in her own terms. Years later, Daniel and his wife went back to the location. They wanted to see if the house was still there. It wasn't. The land was completely clear. Not just demolished, no trace. As if the house had never been there at all. He tries to recall her face. He replays those few seconds in the doorway over and over. What he saw was old and wrinkled and still. But something about the way she turned, abruptly, too quickly for someone that appeared so fragile, has always stayed with him. He tells himself it was just a woman. Just someone living out her final years in the house she'd always known. in a room she'd never left. But something in the way she hummed says otherwise, and he doesn't fully believe himself. There is a particular kind of loneliness that we only recognize in other people once it's too late to do anything about it. The man in this final story, we'll call him Ryan, moved to a new neighborhood in middle school. New house, new street, new set of faces to learn. By most measures, it was a good move. Bigger house, good neighborhood, plenty of kids his age. Except for the neighbor. The man who lived next door was the kind of neighbor that kids know instantly. The one who watches from the window. The one who knocks on the glass whenever you get within a few feet of his yard. Not the sidewalk. Not his porch. Just the general proximity of his property line. Ryan and his friends were good kids. They played football in the street. They stayed off his grass. They respected the boundary. It didn't matter. Every time they came outside, the banging started. The shouting through the glass. The shaking hand pointing toward the road. It went on for about 6 months after Ryan moved in. And then one day, it stopped. The neighbor didn't appear. The window was dark. The house was quiet. Ryan joked to a friend that maybe the old man had finally died. It was a middle school joke, the kind you make without thinking, the kind that lands at the time and disappears from memory almost immediately. Except he was right. About a month later, on an early morning when it was still dark, Ryan and a friend who was sleeping over were woken up by noise. They got up and looked out the window. Flashing lights from an emergency vehicle, and 2 people carrying a body bag. Ryan said later that the feeling in that moment wasn't what he expected. He'd seen this scene in movies. In movies it looks clinical, procedural, distant. In real life, standing at his window as a 12-year-old in the dark, it felt very different. It felt heavy. And then it felt guilty. Because immediately, the joke he'd made came back to him. And something in his gut told him the old man had been dead for a while before anyone found him. He didn't know that for certain. But the math felt right. The silence had started a full month before the ambulance came. 1 month of a dark window and a quiet house, and nobody had noticed. The house was left after that. The old man apparently had one son who lived in another state. The son didn't come back. The house sat. Everything inside left exactly where it was. For years, Ryan would look out his bedroom window, his room directly across from the neighbors, and see inside. The book still open on the arm of the recliner. As high school went on, Ryan and his friends developed a running gag about the house next door being haunted. It was the kind of joke that only works because there's something real underneath it. Not that anyone actually believed in ghosts, but the possibility was genuinely unsettling, and the unsettling feeling was genuine, even if the ghost part wasn't. Ryan's friend Joel was always the most reactive to the bit. Every time Ryan claimed he'd seen the old man in the window, Joel would physically cover his ears. The whole room would laugh. It was a reliable game, until Joel got tired of being the punchline. One night, Joel flipped it, called Ryan out directly, said that if the house was so funny, Ryan should go inside. Ryan didn't love the idea. Breaking into the house next door was a different kind of thing than joking about it from his bedroom window. Technically a crime. Technically disrespectful to a dead man's space. He said all of this. Joel called him a coward. Ryan thought about it. The house had been empty for years. The son clearly wasn't coming back. Nobody would notice. He'd be inside for 5 minutes, come back with a story, and they'd move on. He went. The front door was locked. He tried kicking it. At the time he weighed maybe 130 pounds, and the door didn't move at all. Next to the door was a small side window. He tried sliding it open. It wasn't locked. It slid open without resistance. He looked back at his house once, his friends watching from the window, and then he climbed inside. The smell was the first thing. Ryan described it as something beyond mustiness, beyond the normal smell of a closed-up old space. It was the smell of a place where something had ended. He had to put the collar of his shirt over his face just to keep moving. He swept his flashlight around the living room. The recliner was there. Beside it, a book with a bookmark still in the middle of a chapter. like someone had set it down to make a cup of coffee and never come back. He moved to the kitchen. The smell was worse there. Small table, a sweater draped over one of the chairs, coffee mug in front of it, the stove with pots and pans still on the burners, coated in dust. Ryan lifted the lid on one, empty, just gray with old buildup. The kitchen felt like the place where time had stopped. The specific corner of the house where the old man's last ordinary moment had happened. Ryan didn't linger. He moved down the narrow hallway, found the room that faced his house, and went inside. He looked out the window. His friends were all there, waving. Joel's face was the expression of someone who didn't think Ryan would actually go through with it. Ryan waved back. And then, from somewhere on the other side of the house, a loud bang. Not subtle, not ambiguous. The sound of something solid hitting the wall. A single loud impact, and then nothing. Ryan stood completely still. He waited. No follow-up sound. His friends, across the street, were looking at him with confused expressions. They'd clearly seen him stop, but didn't know why. Ryan was done. He walked to the front door, unlocked it from the inside, and let himself out. He told his friends what he'd heard. They talked about it, passed theories back and forth for a while, and then the conversation moved on the way teenage conversations do. They went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Joel shook Ryan awake. Ryan asked what he wanted. Joel said he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing sounds from next door. Ryan dismissed it immediately. Told Joel it was just his imagination, that hearing the bang earlier had primed his brain to find more sounds where there weren't any. Joel went quiet. And in that quiet, Ryan heard it too. 2 knocks. Clear and separate. Somewhere from the direction of the neighbor's house. Joel confirmed it, said that was exactly the sound, that it had been happening every few minutes. Ryan got up and looked out the window. The neighbor's house was dark. He scanned the windows one by one. Joel grabbed his arm and pointed. In the window of the room where Ryan had been standing just hours earlier, the room that faced theirs, there was a shape. A silhouette. Standing at the back of the room, framed in the doorway leading further into the house. Just standing there. Ryan told himself it was a coat rack. There had been a coat rack in the living room, maybe one in the hallway too. Maybe that's what they were seeing. Joel said it moved. And then their other friends woke up, drawn by the commotion, and one by one they looked out the window. And they all saw it. The shape had moved from the doorway to the window. It was now standing directly on the other side of the glass, facing their house. It was a silhouette. A person-shaped silhouette. Standing completely still. And then it started to move. Slowly, deliberately, it turned from the window and walked back toward the doorway. Step by step, it retreated into the darkness of the interior until the shape was no longer visible. Ryan and his friends watched that window for the rest of the night, taking turns, barely sleeping. The shape didn't come back. About a year later, the old man's son finally showed up. He arrived with a dumpster truck, cleared the house in a few days, and put it on the market. Ryan's father spoke with him briefly. The son said he'd had a difficult relationship with his father. They had been estranged for years. It had taken him a long time to be ready to face the house. He had never been there before. Not that year. Not the year before. Not on the night they'd seen the shape in the window. Ryan has thought about that fact many times since. He has tried every angle. A neighbor wandering in through the same unlocked window he'd used. An animal that somehow looked person-shaped from across the street in the dark. A trick of the light from a passing car, hitting the windows in just the right way. He's been through all of them. None of them hold up completely. What he keeps coming back to is this. He had several witnesses. Not one person seeing something in the dark and later wondering if they'd imagined it. Multiple people from the same window, watching the same shape move. Watching it turn. Watching it walk away. He still sees those friends about once a year. They still live in different places, scattered across the country. And every time they get together, someone brings up the neighbor's house. Every single time. Because they all saw it. And none of them have ever been able to say what it was. 3 abandoned places. Three groups of people who walked into somewhere they shouldn't have. Three moments that changed the way each of them understood the world. I've said this before, and I believe it genuinely. There's almost always a rational explanation for the things people encounter in dark and forgotten places. Old houses make sounds. Homeless individuals sometimes shelter in abandoned structures. Shadows move in ways that our pattern-seeking minds transform into shapes. Almost always. But sometimes the explanation that fits best still doesn't fit completely. Sometimes there's a gap between what could have happened and what was actually experienced. And that gap, small as it is where these stories live. What was the woman in the black dress doing at the car? Who was humming in the rocking chair? What stood at that window in the dark? Maybe you have an answer. Maybe the right piece of context would make it all collapse into something obvious and simple. Maybe. But these people were there. And years later, in some quiet part of them, the question is still open. That's all for tonight's episode of Forgotten Cases. If something in these stories reminded you of something you've experienced, a moment you've never been able to fully explain, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. Every story matters. Every account gets read. Take care of yourselves. Stay somewhere well lit tonight, and we'll see you next time.